Why the most spiritually awake people choose solitude. Alan Watts, you've probably noticed something strange about people who are truly awake, not just intellectually sharp or emotionally intelligent, but spiritually conscious. They're not always the loudest in the room. They're not the ones constantly seeking attention, validation, or applause. In fact, the most spiritually awake individuals often seem to vanish, not in despair, not in bitterness, but in a kind of sacred withdrawal. They retreat from the noise not because they hate the world, but because they're finally beginning to understand it. And in understanding the world, they realize something most of us spend our lives trying to avoid. The world is loud because we are afraid to be quiet. It's crowded because we're terrified of being alone. But solitude, as Alan Watts taught, isn't emptiness. It's fullness. It's not isolation. It's intimacy with everything. Now here's the hook, the thing we never question but should. Why do we assume that being alone is a problem to be solved, rather than a state to be revered? From a young age, we're conditioned to believe that being alone means being unloved, unwanted, or unsuccessful. Social creatures, we're told. We're meant to be together, to build tribes, communities, networks. And yes, connection is beautiful. But when connection becomes a distraction from self-awareness, when our relationships become a way to avoid our own silence, solitude becomes not just important but essential. Because in solitude, we meet the one person we can never escape.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
Alan Watts, that eloquent bridge builder between East and West, understood this deeply. He often spoke about the illusion of separateness, the ego's desperate attempt to maintain the story of me versus everything else. But the irony is, when you are constantly surrounded by people, by stimulation, by roles and expectations, you never get the chance to see that it is a story. You're too busy playing your part. Solitude then becomes the radical act of stepping off stage, of stripping away the costume, the script, the audience, and asking yourself, who am I without all of this? And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of us don't want to know the answer. Because if we're honest, we've built our entire identity on things outside of us. Our job, our relationships, our reputation, our productivity. But when all of that is gone, when it's just you, sitting in a room without a phone, without a task, without someone else to reflect you back to yourself, what's left? That moment is terrifying for the ego and liberating for the soul. Because if you can sit in that space, in that emptiness, long enough, something shifts. You begin to hear your own thoughts. Then you begin to question them. Then, if you're truly patient, you go beyond them. This is why spiritually awake people choose solitude. Not because they are antisocial, not because they're depressed or broken, but because they are curious. They want to see what lies beneath the surface of self. They want to see what remains when the chatter stops. Because they know the truth. The world outside is just a mirror of the world inside. And if the inner world is chaotic, no amount of external connection will bring peace. Solitude isn't about avoiding the world. It's about preparing to meet it from a place of wholeness. Think about this. When was the last time you were truly alone, no distractions, no noise, just you and your breath? For most of us, solitude is accidental. A few minutes in the shower, a walk to the store. But deliberate solitude, the kind that spiritually awake people seek, is a practice. It's a choice. It's sitting with discomfort until it becomes clarity. It's facing boredom until it becomes depth. It's sitting with pain until it becomes understanding. And it's seeing through the illusion that we need to be constantly plugged in to matter. Alan Watts often reminded us that we are not in the universe, we are the universe, playing a game of hide and seek with itself. And solitude is when the game stops, when the seeker gives up and simply is. That's where awakening begins, not in the pursuit of more but in the surrender to less. Not in trying to fix the self, but in realizing the self was never broken, only buried. So now the question is yours. What if your loneliness isn't a flaw, but an invitation? What if solitude isn't the absence of love, but the presence of truth? And what if the very thing you've been avoiding, your own company, is the key to everything you've been seeking? Beyond the noise, how silence becomes a portal to the infinite. Silence is a strange thing. In our hyper-stimulated world, it feels unnatural, awkward, even hostile. We try to fill it with background music, small talk, scrolling, anything to avoid its unrelenting presence. But what if silence isn't empty at all? What if silence is the most alive thing there is? Alan Watts once said that silence is not the absence of something, but the presence of everything. It is not the void, but the space in which all things arise and dissolve. And the spiritually awake person begins to see this not as theory, not as poetry, but as direct experience. Because when you spend enough time in solitude, the noise of the world fades, and underneath there it is pure, vibrating, sacred stillness. The infinite, hiding in plain sight. But here's the paradox. Silence doesn't reveal itself to the one who demands it. It arrives when we've stopped trying. You can't chase silence. You have to create the conditions for it. That's why solitude is so important. It's the container, the clearing, the empty vessel into which silence can pour. And when it does, something profound happens. Reality stops being a concept and becomes an encounter. You stop thinking about life and you start feeling it. Alan Watts pointed out that most people treat life like a problem to be solved. But life isn't a problem, it's a dance, a song. And what makes music beautiful is not just the notes, but the spaces between them. Silence is not the interruption of meaning, it is the context of meaning. But we don't see that because we're addicted to noise. Not just external noise, notifications, conversations, the endless hum of daily life, but internal noise too. The voice in our head that never shuts up. The constant commentary, the analysis, the worry, the projecting, the remembering, the rehearsing. And the spiritually awake person realizes that most of this noise is useless. Not because thought is bad, but because unconscious thought is like static. It blocks the signal. It keeps us from hearing the deeper frequency of existence. Silence, then, is not just the absence of sound, it's the death of compulsive thinking. It's the space where thought dies and awareness begins. And in that space, you don't just understand truth, you become it. Have you ever experienced a moment so quiet, so still, that it felt like the world stopped moving? Maybe it was standing under a star-filled sky, or watching the snow fall with no one around, or sitting in meditation and suddenly everything dropped away. No past, no future, just this. That moment wasn't nothing. It was everything. And yet we miss it every day. We talk over it. We scroll past it. We drown it out, not because it's unimportant, but because it's too pure. It demands everything. It asks us to let go of the small self, the story self, the ego self, and merge into something vast and unknowable. And that kind of surrender is terrifying until it's not. Until you realize that what you're surrendering isn't who you are, it's who you thought you had to be. And this is why the spiritually awake choose solitude. Not because they hate people, not because they're trying to escape life, but because they want to meet it fully, nakedly, without distraction. They want to hear the silence underneath the chaos. They want to feel the breeze without naming it. They want to experience their own being without the need for reflection or feedback. Because in that silence, something ancient wakes up, something timeless, Alan Watts called it the eternal now. Others call it God, presence, awareness. It doesn't matter what name you use. What matters is that you touch it. And once you do, everything changes. Suddenly, you're no longer seeking meaning, you are meaning. You're no longer searching for connection, you are connected. And you realize something shocking. You were never alone. You were always held, always part of something infinite. But the noise kept you from hearing it. So ask yourself, what silence is waiting underneath your noise? What truth is trying to reach you if only you'd stop talking long enough to hear it? And are you brave enough to let silence speak? The disappearing self. Why awakening means letting go of who you think you are. Solitude and silence don't just calm the mind, they strip it. They peel back layer after layer of identity until you're left with a terrifying, liberating question. Who am I if I'm not who I thought I was? At first, this feels like death, and in a way it is. Not of the body, but of the ego, the psychological mask we wear to navigate the world, to be accepted, to feel safe. But the spiritually awake person begins to see that the ego, while necessary in some ways, is also a prison. It traps us in roles. It makes us believe that we are the sum of our titles, our possessions, our opinions, our memories. But solitude, especially when deeply embraced, begins to dissolve all of that. It doesn't destroy the ego, it simply reveals that it was never the whole story. Alan Watts often spoke about this illusion, the illusion of the separate self. The idea that we are individual entities, cut off from the rest of existence, floating alone in a vast, indifferent universe. But what if that's not true? What if the self you cling to is just a wave that forgot it was the ocean? What if your truest nature is not a thing at all, but a process, a movement, a dance of energy within the great unfolding of everything? This is what silence and solitude begin to uncover, not conceptually, but experientially. When the mind stops racing, you begin to feel the space between the thoughts. And in that space, the self begins to loosen. It starts to blur around the edges. And then, finally, it vanishes. But here's the twist. When the self disappears, you don't die, you wake up. You realize that what you thought was you was just a character, a story written by memory, fear, desire, and culture. And the real you, the you, that's aware of all of it, that you can't define. You can't point to it. You can't describe it. But you are it. You're not the actor. You're not even the audience. You're the stage on which the whole play unfolds. And once you see that, solitude is no longer lonely. It becomes communion. You're alone, but you're not separate. You're not isolated, you're infinite. But the ego doesn't go down easily. It clings. It fights. It whispers, "Who are you without me?" And the truth is, for a while, you won't know. There will be a period of disorientation, even despair. That's part of the path. It's the dark night of the soul that mystics have spoken of for centuries. But if you can stay with it, if you can resist the urge to run back to distraction, to identity, to noise, you'll pass through the darkness and come out into something vast and wordless, something that feels more like home than anything you've ever known. This is why solitude is not just a preference for the spiritually awake, it's a necessity. Because only in solitude can the false self be seen clearly enough to be released. And only in the release of the self can true freedom begin. Not freedom to do whatever you want, but freedom from the compulsive need to define yourself. Freedom from the exhausting performance of being someone. And in that freedom, love arises. Not the kind of love that clings or needs, but the love that simply is. A love that sees everything as itself. A love that doesn't ask for anything in return because it's already whole. So let me ask you, who would you be if you stopped trying to be anyone at all? What would remain if every label, every accomplishment, every memory, every fear was stripped away? Would you still exist? And if so, what would that existence feel like? This is not a game of philosophy, it's the truth behind all the noise, all the striving, all the pretending. The spiritually awake person steps back not to escape life, but to finally live it as it is. Not as a person walking through the world, but as the world walking through a person. And in that reversal, the self doesn't vanish into nothing. It melts into everything. Returning to the world, why true solitude makes you love more deeply than ever before. There's a strange and beautiful irony in the journey of solitude. You start by walking away from the world, from people, from noise, not out of bitterness, but because something deep within you longs for truth. You seek silence, you seek clarity, you seek something real. And in that space, as the noise fades and the self dissolves, you don't become less human, you become more. Because in the absence of distraction, you begin to feel life as it is, not as you were taught to see it. And what you discover isn't cold detachment or stoic indifference. What you discover is love, raw, unfiltered, unconditional love. Not the kind that needs a name or a face or a reason. Just love, flowing through everything, including you. Alan Watts often emphasized that the self and the world are not two separate things. He said, "You are an aperture through which the universe is looking at and exploring itself." This isn't just poetic, it's deeply practical. Because when you've spent time in solitude, when you've allowed silence to wash away the false layers of who you thought you had to be, you begin to see others differently. You begin to see yourself in them, not metaphorically, but literally. Their pain feels like your pain, their joy, your joy. Not because you've been told to be empathetic, but because the illusion of separation has weakened. And in its place is something far more intimate, unity. This changes everything. Because now, when you return to the world, you do so not to take from it, not to prove anything, not to escape yourself through others. You return to give. You return to serve, not out of obligation, but out of abundance. You're no longer trying to complete yourself through relationships, achievements, or approval. You've already touched that completeness in solitude. You carry it with you, and so your presence becomes a gift. You stop needing people to be a certain way for you to love them. You stop needing life to unfold according to your plan. You begin to meet the world as it is, not as a projection of your unmet needs. But let's be clear, this doesn't mean you become passive or indifferent. It means you become engaged in a deeper way. You listen more. You speak less, but when you do, your words carry weight. You act with intention. You begin to see that love isn't just a feeling, it's a state of being. A way of walking through the world that leaves everything a little more whole than you found it. And the source of that love is not out there, it's within. It always was. But you had to go away to see it. You had to lose yourself to find it. So here's the deepest truth of all. Solitude doesn't separate you from the world. It prepares you to embrace it fully. It doesn't make you cold, it makes you warm in a way that's unshakable. Because you've seen the root of suffering, the belief that we are separate, alone, incomplete. And in seeing through that illusion, you become a living reminder that we are not. You become a mirror for others to see their own wholeness. And maybe that's the final paradox. The ones who love the world most deeply are often the ones who chose to leave it for a while, not to escape it, but to remember what it really is. And in remembering, they return not as seekers, but as finders. Not as broken people looking for healing, but as whole beings offering it. So I'll leave you with this question. What would your presence feel like to others if you no longer needed anything from them? What kind of love could you offer if your cup was already full? That is the gift of solitude, That is the wisdom of silence. That is the awakening of the self that disappears and returns as the world itself. And that is why the most spiritually awake people choose solitude.